everyone, and thank you for joining us for the New Lines Institute for Strategy and Policy Global Hotspots podcast. I'm your host for today, Milos Majore, and I'll be talking to my colleague, Andrew Loftusness, about some of the key developments this week related to geopolitical hotspots and their implications on global connectivity themes like trade, technology, energy, and climate. As always, you can find a more in-depth analysis and forecast of these topics in our weekly forecast monitor, published every Friday alongside this podcast. Today, we're going to be starting off as usual with a brief roundup of all of our major developments happening in each of the hotspots we cover. And as a reminder, those are the Middle East, the Indo-Pacific, and the Russia-Ukraine conflict within the scope of transatlantic relations. And then we'll take a quick look at some of the developments coming out of Ethiopia, the DRC, and the United States. And then we'll follow up with a discussion on an update on various fronts in the Middle East, including the ceasefire deal between Lebanon and Israel. So with that in mind, let's jump into our roundup. Andrew, what have you got for us from the Middle East and Russia-Ukraine?
Thank you, Milos, and good morning to everyone listening. So a number of updates from the Middle East this week where we saw, against all odds, a trend towards diplomatic de-escalation as the ceasefire between the United States and Iran held. And this is a very tenuous ceasefire, of course. There were exchanges of fire from the U.S. and Iran, as well as Iranian strikes against Kuwait's international airport, which killed at least one person and wounded numerous others. Meanwhile, Israel and Lebanon agreed to a conditional ceasefire during U.S.-mediated talks in D.C. We can get into the details of that a bit later in this discussion and exactly what that ceasefire is contingent upon. Now, of course, this agreement comes as there are reports in the media of significant tensions between Trump and Netanyahu, in particular from a phone call that they shared. Meanwhile, Israeli defense minister said on June 4th, and this was the day after the announcement of the ceasefire agreement between Israel and Lebanon, that Israel would continue its ground operations and sustain its territorial occupation in southern Lebanon, which is, of course, playing out as we speak. An Israeli airstrike in Gaza, meanwhile, on June 4th, killed at least 9 Palestinians. There's also recent reporting that confirms that Israel has expanded its territorial occupation in Gaza since the declaration of the ceasefire between Israel and Hamas last October. Israel also recently announced that they are preparing to build over 2,000 new settlements in the West Bank. Turning now to Europe, we saw the Russia-Ukraine war continue this recent trend towards military escalation. Russia sustained its intensified bombardment campaign against Kyiv and, of course, numerous other Ukrainian cities. Kyiv itself, though, is the primary target of this intensified effort by the Russians. And very notably, there was a Ukrainian drone attack against oil infrastructure in St. Petersburg. Now, this attack occurred as Russia was hosting the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum on June 3rd, colloquially referred to as the Russian Davos. It's a significant diplomatic and economic event for Russia. The pictures from that attack are quite striking. Clearly, the Ukrainians were trying to send a message and succeeded in doing so. I encourage listeners to give that a Google and check that out. Meanwhile, Marco Rubio confirmed that Trump will attend the upcoming NATO conference in Turkey this July, and all EU member states, including Hungary, have now consented to begin accession talks for Ukraine and Moldova to join the Union. This, of course, is a significant policy change in Budapest following the recent Hungarian elections. And on that note, Hungary's new Prime Minister, Peter Magyar, has suggested that Budapest itself could host future negotiations between Russia and Ukraine.
Thanks, Andrew. And now turning to the Indo-Pacific. So the region remained at the status quo this week as US Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth addressed the Indo-Pacific allies at the annual Shangri-La Dialogue, where he called for both increased defense spending as well as continued stability in the region. The US Department of Commerce issued new guidance for closing a loophole that allowed advanced AI chips to be sold to Chinese foreign subsidiaries outside of Chinese mainland territory. Then in the Philippines, the Secretary of Defense called for increased defense ties with Taiwan, jumping on a recent trend that we've seen from numerous other countries in the region, including Japan. From the US, President Trump postponed plans to hold a phone call with Taiwanese President Lai Ching-te about arms sales to the island, potentially postponing the sale of a $14 billion arms sale that was already scheduled and postponed back in January. And then China's Coast Guard finally conducted patrols following last week's meeting between Japan and the Philippines. The patrols were conducted near Taiwanese-controlled islands, and the Chinese state media said that this was in response to recent discussions that Japan and the Philippines were having with regards to potentially redrawing the maritime zone delimitations. So we'll be keeping an eye on that going forwards. Some other notable developments we've been keeping an eye on this week outside of these hotspots include the United States, where domestically we've seen that following weeks of bipartisan backlash, Trump has ended his attempts to establish a $1.8 billion fund to help compensate individuals that faced legal prosecution, including January 6th rioters. Trump's backing down comes after Republican members of Congress refused to support his new Department of Homeland Security budget should the, quote, anti-weaponization fund go through. Shifting internationally, still with the United States in mind, the Trump administration also proposed tariffs ranging between 10% and 12.5% on more than 60 countries. The recommendation follows a series of trade investigations into imported goods allegedly produced with forced labor, and this is per Section 301 of the 1974 Trade Act. The U.S. Trade Representative's Office recommended 10% tariffs on countries including Taiwan, the UK, Canada, Mexico, and the EU, among others, while the 12% tariffs would apply to China, India, and Japan, amongst others. This follows the Trump administration's efforts to make up for the withdrawal of the IEEPA tariffs that were removed back in February. Shifting to the African continent, where in Ethiopia, we saw that Ethiopia's ruling Prosperity Party, led by the Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, is projected to win local and parliamentary elections held this week. Balloting was, however, not held in the Tigray province after the National Election Board of Ethiopia ruled that conditions were not favorable in light of the political turmoil following the civil war that started in 2020. Critics of the government have previously accused it of human rights abuses and oppression of dissidents, something the government obviously has denied. And finally, taking a look at the Democratic Republic of the Congo, where the DRC government has reopened Bunia Airport in the Ituri region, which, as a reminder, is the region that was hit hardest by the recent Ebola outbreak. The decision follows a recent trip by the World Health Organization Director General, who stated that he saw signs of improvement in the region. The reopening would permit increased humanitarian assistance to fly in, although all passengers will still require extensive screening. The latest government figures place the number of confirmed Ebola cases in the country at 321, with deaths estimated to be around 48. And that's it for our roundup for this week. Now, turning it to the discussion segment, Andrew, I thought it would be interesting to unpack some of the developments in the Middle East. You mentioned some potential tension actually emerging between the US and Israel with regards to operations in Lebanon and how that plays into the broader Iran conflict. So how did that come about, and what should we expect going into next?
So at the highest level, the tension is over the fact that the Iranians are insisting that Israel's war in Lebanon has to end as a precondition for any permanent, so to speak, peace agreement between Iran and the United States. Most of the international community, including many major American allies who are involved in the diplomatic process, are on board with that initiative. I should note, for probably different reasons than the Iranian government is, but nonetheless. So the issue of Israel's war in Lebanon is a significant holdup right now from the perspective of the Trump administration in securing a deal with the Iranians. Now, what I was referencing in our roundup there is that this kind of boiled over in the last couple of days in a personal phone call between Trump and Netanyahu. I won't read the transcript from that in this episode, but I definitely encourage listeners to look that up and read it for themselves. But in very explicit terms, Trump told Netanyahu that his war in Lebanon is holding up his, meaning Trump's own efforts to reopen the Strait of Hormuz and to secure a peace deal with Iran. Now, in the past we've talked about there is definitely a divergence of long-term security and economic interest between the U.S. and Israel over the war in Iran and exactly what any sort of permanent deal should look like going forward. But I think if you don't mind, let's keep the topic on Lebanon, actually, because I think in a lot of discussion right now, at least in American media, all the attention, and there's reasons for this, of course, but is specifically over tensions in the Strait of Hormuz, and the war in Lebanon is discussed really as a sideshow next to the larger war in Iran and the global ramifications of security threats and economic disruption in the Strait of Hormuz. So in the beginning of this conversation, I mentioned that there was a conditional ceasefire that was recently agreed to between Israel and Lebanon and talks that the Trump administration is hosting in DC, and they have been for the last few weeks. Now, that ceasefire is contingent on the Lebanese army denying territory from Hezbollah and eventually achieving the disarmament of Hezbollah. Right now, that's a whole other conversation. That's this whole episode. But these initial steps, they're basically saying, and they use these words. It's basically a pilot program, right? They're even calling them like pilot territories. They're testing whether this is a sustainable option for the Lebanese army to seize territory from Hezbollah. Now, this does not include, the current ceasefire agreement does not include a demand for Israeli withdrawal from Lebanon. And in fact, that agreement was announced June 3rd, and then on June 4th, as we mentioned, the Israeli defense minister has said essentially that things are full steam ahead on the ground in southern Lebanon, and that is certainly the case. I think it would be helpful to take a step back and look at how ceasefires with Israel in relation to its territorial occupations with some of its other neighbors have gone, because this is certainly going to factor into negotiations between Israel and Lebanon going on in DC right now. Something we've talked about on this podcast over the last couple of weeks, and that we referenced a minute ago, is how in the ceasefire deal between Israel and Hamas, Israel was supposed to conduct a 3-phased withdrawal out of Gaza territory. They conducted the initial phase and withdrew to what has since been dubbed the Yellow Line, but even that has not been stagnant. Netanyahu himself recently publicly confirmed that after the initial pullback to the Yellow Line, Israel still occupied 53% of territory in Gaza. Since that initial pullback, they have been expanding that line up to 60%. And then again, this is according to Netanyahu himself, they intend to occupy a total of 70% of territory in Gaza. Israel immediately expanded its occupation in the area of the Golan Heights in Syria following the collapse of the Assad government. They continue to hold that territory. And as these talks between Israel and Lebanon have been going on in Washington, D.C., the Israelis have expanded ground operations north of the Litani River. So I put that out there. I don't think there's enough discussion on that, but that's certainly going to factor into the long-term decision making of these Lebanese negotiators. And then again, the question of Hezbollah, of course, rejected the ceasefire out of hand. Effectively, there's not a ceasefire at all right now in southern Lebanon. Now, the U.S. is exercising some restraint and exerting pressure over Israel, as we saw in that phone call between Trump and Netanyahu, but it remains to be seen exactly how far the U.S. is willing to go in that direction.
Yeah, I was going to ask, do you think that this is significant enough that the US would in any way reduce its aid or its backing of Israel, or is it just, just frustration from the Trump administration, but at the same time the support will continue?
Trump is willing to, this will be an obvious statement at this point, but break away from American foreign policy orthodoxy, right? Something else we should mention actually is that Trump recently, again, in his own words, had a great call with Hezbollah, right? Specifically, he was speaking to Hezbollah leadership in the Lebanese parliament, right? But the Trump administration, we know, is also negotiating directly with Hamas over ongoing ceasefire implementation talks in Egypt, right? And there's numerous other examples where he's willing to break away from decades of traditional American foreign policy. So I think the answer to your question is that he might be the most likely American president to do that, but I don't think it will happen. I think for domestic American political reasons, that would still be a bridge too far.
And I know that you said you wanted to focus mainly on Lebanon, but I'd feel remiss not asking what your take is on the recent decision within US Congress to limit the US's ability to continue its war with Iran, right? I think that passed a couple of days ago. I should say we're recording this on the morning of Friday, June 5th. Is that significant? Is that something that you think will actually hamper the Trump administration's ability to conduct strikes in Iran? Or because we saw quite a lot of exchanges of strikes even this week, even though both sides seem to talk about that continuing of the ceasefire and continuing of negotiations. So what's your take on that?
So I think that it will be significant politically for the GOP in upcoming American midterm elections. Will it be significant in curtailing Trump's ambitions and even perhaps likelihood of returning to offensive operations in Iran? I don't think so.
Significant in the elections? Do you mean it would actually give the GOP an advantage?
No, sorry, the opposite, actually. It's simply a fact going by the polls that the war is tremendously unpopular amongst the majority of the American population. Trump has personally decided to write off the political cost, saying recently, of course, that he does not care about the midterms and he does not care about the financial impact of the war on American families. And again, those are public statements from the president. Now, Trump perhaps assesses that he can absorb that political cost. I don't know that GOP nominees running in any given district of any given red state can absorb that themselves, right? And I think we'll see that play out in the midterms, but I don't think this, for now, will have it's very interesting to read into the domestic political situation in the United States, but I don't think it will have a significant impact on whatever the Trump administration pursues next in Iran.
Right. Well, I think bringing it back to the discussion between Trump and Netanyahu, I mean, it seems that clearly there's an incentive and certainly the will by Trump and his team to try and de-escalate things in the region, whether it's for domestic purposes or not. It just seems to be a fact at this point that this de-escalation trend is certainly the intended goal. Now, whether or not we'll see flares up of escalation remains to be seen, obviously.
And I mean, it should also be noted that Netanyahu is taking a lot of heat domestically right now from Israelis who don't think that he's going hard enough in Lebanon, right? And he's there's quite a bit we could get into there, but I think he is feeling pressure from the United States right now, right? Certainly not as much as the U.S. is capable of applying, to go back to your question about actual reduction in foreign aid. But that has been interesting to watch the Israeli domestic reaction to what they perceive as a lack of adequate aggression in offensive operations.
Gotcha. Well, I think that's a lot to keep track of that we will undoubtedly be examining in the next couple of weeks. I think it'll be interesting to see what the fallout, what the results of this conversation is, whether it's significant or not. But as we said, certainly seems to be that there are efforts and forces playing towards that diplomatic de-escalation in the region. Now, I wanted to briefly also explore some of the developments coming from Europe, specifically with regards to the Ukraine conflict. We saw quite a lot of institutional developments this week. I mean, for a start, there was a kind of reassuring statement, as it were, from the NATO perspective, where, as you mentioned up top, Marco Rubio, US Secretary of State, did confirm that Trump will attend the NATO summit in Ankara in Turkey. And this, obviously the US president has always attended these summits, but with the Trump presidency, it's been put into a substantial amount of doubt in recent years, and especially in recent months, with regards to the Trump administration's perceived grievance of lack of effort with regards to NATO countries helping out in the Iran conflict. So I think all the European NATO states are definitely quite interested, or rather quite reassured with that statement. But I think an interesting development is this one coming out of the EU, where it seems that now all 27 countries have consented and given their approval to begin accession talks for Ukraine and Moldova, right? And this is quite significant for a number of reasons. I mean, this first is that this isn't an overnight process, right? This is something that has been in discussions for years already, right? And we know this, and usually the culprit in this being held up has been the Hungarian Prime Minister, Viktor Orban, who obviously lost the election a couple of months ago. And as a result, I suspect that now there was that renewed impetus with Peter Magyar, kind of coming in and re-establishing that consensus with regards to this. But there's also another interesting fact, which is that the EU, there were members that, even though they were pro-Ukraine accession, there were voices within the EU that, even though they supported the accession of Ukraine to the EU, they stated that there were a lot of problems within the EU that would make that difficult. For a start, a lot of the budget allocation within the EU is calculated off of a member state's landmass, right? So this is about agricultural policy and budgeting and stuff like that. So obviously, the European countries are quite small, so, with regards to, compared to like the United States and that. So, the biggest one really up until this point has been like Germany and perhaps France, right? And they get a lot of agricultural funding. But Ukraine is a different story. It's basically the length of the rest of Europe, right? So obviously the system as it stands right now would be ill-equipped to properly manage that funding. So I'm wondering whether this renewed impetus for talks of accession means that there's also going to be some impetus for EU reform of some kind, right? And it may not be the big thing that a lot of European federalists talk about, people who really want a lot of concrete reforms. It may just be small stuff, but at the very least, we may be hearing more and more reforms coming out of the EU, at the very least planned as negotiations go along. So definitely going to be interesting looking at that. And obviously it brings with it a big advantage for Ukraine in the sense of finally joining the bloc, which we know is something that Zelenskyy has wanted for a long time. So will be interesting to see where that goes. But apart from all of this institutional developments, Andrew, I wanted to get your take on some of the military developments. Obviously, Ukraine has been increasing its long-range strike capability, but this week in particular, we saw an interesting, or rather quite a significant, strike near St. Petersburg in Russia. What's your sense on how significant that actually was and what it means with regards to the war in general?
Well, I think it's actually quite significant. We're seeing for the first time in the course of the entire war a significant shift in how the Russian government, including Putin himself, are addressing the war and these flaws in Russian air defense systems to the Russian home front, right? And a massive, and clearly this is what the Ukrainians were trying to achieve, a massive smoke cloud billowing over the Russian Davos in St. Petersburg sends quite the message, right? And the other thing I'll note is that Zelenskyy followed that up, I think we can say, yesterday with an open letter to Putin saying, let's meet one-on-one, you and I, and talk and end this war, right? Which I think is very interesting. You know, there's the Trump administration has, to put it lightly, the Trump administration has deprioritized its diplomatic efforts to end the war in Ukraine since the start of the war in Iran. I think arguably even a little bit before that, but just to stay on topic here, a direct meeting between Zelenskyy and Putin is something that Trump has been pushing for really since his return to office. Now, the strike in St. Petersburg grabbed a lot of attention, as it should. It's very notable. It is meaningful. What is more meaningful, though, is that this was not a one-off event, right? The Ukrainians have been demonstrating an increased ability to strike inside of Moscow itself, and, you know, sort of like the social contract, if you will, between Putin and the Russian people, or at least the elites of Russian society, was that, you know, he will conduct his war. You don't have to worry about it. If you live in Moscow and St. Petersburg, it won't affect you. You won't be drafted. Mind your own business. We'll mind our business. Of course, that was never truly the case, but that was the deal, right? And now that social contract there's some flaws in that armor that are starting to emerge. The Ukrainians certainly are not going to take their foot off the pedal, hence this escalation from Russia against, again, really every city in Ukraine, but especially Kyiv. And it remains to be seen, one, like what the Russians will do next, and two, you know, what else the Ukrainians have up their sleeves.
Gotcha. So likely that we'll see a significant rise in escalation, or at least the continuation of these military strikes, these tit for tats, before we get any kind of de-escalation. But certainly here as well, the forces are at play, and it seems that that's the trend that we're heading towards. So we'll be updating you with that as the weeks go along, obviously. But with that, we'll have to wrap it up here for today. And as a reminder to our listeners, if you'd like a more in-depth analysis and forecasting related to all of the topics that we've talked about and more, please check out the weekly forecast monitor on our website at newlinesinstitute.org, where you can also register to receive our weekly newsletter and access to our geopolitical forecasting platform for real-time updates around the world. Thanks, Andrew, for joining me. Thank you all for listening. Take care.
Thanks, everyone.